Black Hills, Dakota Territory, August 1876. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the promise of gold, but Ewan McBride was not looking for yellow rock. He was looking at the pale, layered face of a sandstone cliff that flanked his small homestead. While other men were sinking shafts or sluicing creeks, McBride was doing something far stranger. With a star drill and a 4-pound hammer, he was methodically chipping a hole into the base of the cliff, just above the floodline of the nearby creek. The work was slow, a rhythmic tink, tink, tink that barely registered over the sound of the wind. By the end of the first week, he had a tunnel barely wide enough for his shoulders. By the end of the month, the tunnel went back 8 feet, then turned sharply to the right. His neighbors watched him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They were practical men, carpenters and farmers who had learned the hard lessons of the plains. They built with logs and sod, proven materials against a proven enemy, the Dakota winter. Hal Mercer, the settlement's most respected builder, stopped by one afternoon, casting a long shadow over McBride's work. Mercer had built half the cabins in the valley, each one a testament to tight-chinked, square-hewn pragmatism. He watched the Scotsman emerge from the hole, face and clothes dusted with fine, pale sand. "McBride," Mercer said, not unkindly, "a man can respect hard work, even when it's pointed in the wrong direction. What in God's name are you doing?" Ewan McBride wiped his brow with the back of a calloused hand. His voice was quiet, with the gentle burr of his native Aberdeenshire. "A winter bedroom," he said. Mercer let out a short, sharp laugh. Several other men who had gathered nearby, Silas Croft and Jedediah Stone among them, shook their heads. "A bedroom? Ewan, that's a badger's den. It'll be a damp, cold burrow unfit for sleeping, let alone living. You'll catch your death of lung fever in there before the first real snow." He pointed toward McBride's own modest but well-built log cabin. "You have a good house. Put your effort into chinking it, bank it with sod. Don't waste your autumn digging a grave." McBride simply nodded, picked up his hammer, and turned back to the cliff face. The mockery lasted through September. The hole in the rock became a local joke, McBride's Folly. The children called it the Prairie Dog Hole. The men called the Scotsman foolish, touched, or simply mad. What did this quiet Scottish quarryman understand about the fundamental physics of thermal mass that these experienced, practical frontier builders had so completely missed? The answer wasn't in the wood, but in the stone. And it would be the difference between a quiet night's sleep and a desperate, losing battle against the cold. If you stick around, I promise you will learn the simple, powerful principle that allowed one family to sleep soundly through a blizzard that terrified an entire territory. Subscribe to this channel and tell us in the comments, what's the strangest, most effective solution to a common problem you've ever seen? Ewan McBride was not a carpenter. He had never been a farmer, and he certainly wasn't a frontiersman by training. He was a man of the stone. For 30 years in Scotland, he had worked in the granite quarries, splitting massive blocks from the earth with feather and wedge. His world was one of precise angles, cleavage planes, and the patient, immense power of thermal expansion. He understood the language of stone, how it held the morning sun long into the cool afternoon, how a slab of slate felt cool to the touch even on the hottest day. His hands knew the heft of a splitting maul, the fine dust of granite, and the deep, resonant hum a solid block of stone gives off when struck just right. He wasn't building a home in the Black Hills, he was shaping a piece of the earth itself. He had come to America with his wife, Aileen, and their 2 small children, Fiona and Hamish, chasing the promise of land. But their first winter, in 1875, had nearly broken them. They had a standard cabin, Built with the help of their neighbors, logs chinked with mud and grass, it looked sturdy. It felt solid, but it was a sieve for heat. That winter was a lesson in failure. Ewan remembered the frost creeping down the inside walls as dusk fell, forming delicate, cruel patterns on the rough-hewn pine. He remembered the wind, a physical presence that found every microscopic gap in the chinking. It didn't just rattle the door. It blew fine streams of ash out from the hearth and across the floor, a constant, gritty reminder of their losing battle. Aileen would heat stones in the fire, wrap them in wool, and place them at the children's feet, but the warmth would be gone in an hour. The blankets were perpetually, achingly cold, feeling damp even when they were bone dry. They burned through their woodpile by February. And Ewan spent the last brutal weeks of winter risking his life felling frozen timber in deep snow. His every calorie of effort repaid with only a few minutes of comfort. The problem wasn't the fire. They could build a roaring blaze that would drive them back from the hearth. The problem was that the moment the fire died down, the cold returned instantly, as if it had been waiting just outside the door. The conventional cabins of the Dakota Territory failed for a reason Ewan understood intimately, even if he didn't use the scientific terms. The failure was rooted in a misunderstanding of heat itself. The log walls, even when thick, had a very low thermal mass. They couldn't store heat. The warmth from the fire would heat the air inside the cabin, a substance with almost no capacity to hold energy. A cubic foot of air at 70 degrees Fahrenheit contains a paltry 1.2 BTUs of heat. A cubic foot of dense sandstone at the same temperature, however, holds over 28 BTUs, more than 20 times the thermal energy. This was the fatal flaw. The settlers were trying to heat the air, and the air was constantly leaking out, replaced by frigid outside air that needed to be heated all over again. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. The wind was the primary enemy. It didn't just feel cold. It actively stole heat through the process of convection. It forced cold air into the cabin through countless tiny cracks, a process called infiltration, while simultaneously stripping heat from the outer surfaces of the logs. The R value of a solid 8-inch pine log wall was only about 10, a decent insulator but no match for a constant 40-mile-per-hour wind at 20 below zero. Hal Mercer and the others fought this by adding more fuel. They burned wood constantly, a brute force approach that required enormous effort for diminishing returns. On the coldest nights, families like the Crofts would huddle together in a single bed, fully clothed, waking every hour to feed a fire that consumed wood at an astonishing rate. The interior of their cabin existed in a state of extreme temperature gradients. It might be 80 degrees a foot from the stove and 35 degrees in the corners. Water buckets froze solid on the floor just 10 feet from a blazing fire. It was a life spent in a constant, exhausting, and ultimately futile energy transaction. Ewan McBride knew he could not win this fight by burning more wood. He had to change the very nature of the battlefield. He had to build a shelter that didn't just resist the cold, but held the warmth. The work on the sandstone chamber was guided by this principle. McBride wasn't just digging a hole. He was sculpting a thermal battery. He chose his tools with care, not dynamite, which would fracture the rock and create invisible cracks for moisture and frost to penetrate, but the slow, precise work of hand steel. He used a set of star drills, ranging from a small 1-inch bit to a larger 3-inch one, and a perfectly balanced, striking hammer. The first and most critical element was the entrance tunnel. His neighbors saw a narrow, awkward passage. Ewan saw a sophisticated airlock. He carved it just 24 inches wide and 5 feet high, forcing a man to turn his shoulders to enter. Crucially, he did not carve it straight. It ran 8 feet directly into the cliff, then took a sharp 90-degree turn to the right for another 4 feet before opening into the main chamber. This L shape was the key. No matter how hard the wind blew from any direction, it could never have a direct path into the sleeping area. The wind's energy would dissipate against the stone walls of the tunnel, its velocity broken. The air that eventually reached the inner chamber would be still. Hal Mercer, stopping by again in late September, scoffed at the design. "You can't even get a proper cot through that tunnel, McBride. How's Aileen supposed to manage? You're building a trap." "We will manage," Ewan said, not looking up from his work. Inside, he hollowed out a chamber that was ruthlessly efficient. It was not meant for living, only for sleeping. It measured 10 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling just high enough for him to stand upright in the center. He spent a week smoothing the walls and floor, not for aesthetics, but to eliminate any small fissures where moisture could collect. He carved a small niche into the far wall for a candle or a small lard lamp, and 2 low, wide platforms on either side of the room, raised 6 inches from the floor. These were their beds, which would be topped with pine boughs and thick buffalo robes. The entire process took him nearly 3 months of steady labor. He moved several tons of sandstone, chip by chip, bucket by bucket. Aileen would bring him his midday meal, her expression a mixture of unwavering faith and quiet concern. "It feels solid, Ewan," she said one day, placing her hand on the tunnel wall. "But the neighbors talk." "Let them talk," Ewan replied. "Stone does not care for talk." The final step was ventilation, a detail the critics in their ignorance missed completely. They assumed the sealed chamber would be a suffocating death trap, filling with stale, unbreathable air. But Ewan, the quarryman, understood how stone breathed. He drilled a single 4-inch wide ventilation shaft, not straight up to the outside, which would have created a chimney for cold air to pour down, but at a steep 45-degree angle up through 20 feet of solid rock to the cliff face high above. This narrow, angled shaft allowed for the slow, passive exchange of air. The warmer, lighter air from their breathing would rise and slowly exit, while heavier, fresh air would gently filter in. The sheer length and narrowness of the shaft meant the incoming air was warmed by the rock it passed through, arriving in the chamber not as a frigid draft, but as a cool, slow seepage of fresh air. It was a masterpiece of passive design. The physics behind McBride's folly was as old as the earth itself. The principle is called thermal mass, and it is the ability of a material to absorb, store, and later release heat energy. While the settlers' log cabins were focused on insulation, resisting the transfer of heat, Ewan's sandstone chamber was focused on thermal storage. Think of it like this: insulation is a shield. It slows down the enemy, the cold, but it doesn't have any power of its own. If the attack is long and relentless enough, the shield will eventually fail, and the cold will get through. Thermal mass, on the other hand, is a reservoir. It's a bank account for heat. Sandstone has a high specific heat capacity, meaning it takes a great deal of energy to change its temperature. It also has high density. Combined, these properties give it enormous thermal mass. Throughout the late summer and autumn, the sandstone cliff had been absorbing trillions of BTUs of solar energy from the sun. The sun beat down on the rock face for 8 to 10 hours a day. And that heat didn't just warm the surface, it slowly, deeply penetrated feet into the stone. The earth itself, at a depth of 10 feet or more, maintains a remarkably stable temperature year-round. In the Black Hills, this is somewhere between 48 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Ewan's chamber was surrounded on 5 of its 6 sides by this colossal, stable mass of rock. The cliff was, in effect, a massive, low-temperature radiator. It would take weeks of sustained, brutal cold to noticeably change the temperature of the rock more than a few feet in. His chamber was thermally coupled to the entire planet. A log cabin, by contrast, is thermally isolated. Its wooden walls have very low thermal mass. They can't store any significant amount of heat. The cabin's warmth is entirely dependent on a constant, active source of heat, the fire. When the fire goes out, the temperature inside plummets, rapidly approaching the outside temperature. The cabin is a flimsy tent in a hurricane of cold. Ewan's chamber was a bunker. The small amount of heat generated by the family's bodies, about 330 BTUs per hour for an adult at rest, and the single candle, another 275 BTUs per hour, was not immediately lost to the outside. Instead, it was slowly absorbed by the surrounding stone walls, gently raising their surface temperature. The walls in turn radiated this mild heat back into the small space, creating a stable, draft-free environment. The temperature inside wouldn't be toasty warm. It would settle at a constant, livable equilibrium, likely around 50 to 55 degrees, regardless of the maelstrom outside. It was the difference between fighting a war and simply refusing to be in one. Winter arrived in December not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as an Arctic hammer blow. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a single afternoon. The sky turned a bruised, metallic gray. Then, the wind began. It was a true plains blizzard, a 3-day siege of horizontal snow and shrieking wind that erased the horizon and made the world outside the door a churning, white chaos. In Hal Mercer's well-built cabin, the fight for survival began. He and his wife stuffed rags into the gaps around the doorframe. The wind, howling at over 50 miles per hour, forced fine, granular snow through invisible cracks in the chinking, dusting the floor and furniture with a layer of white. The temperature inside, even with the stove burning hot enough to glow cherry red, struggled to stay above 40 degrees. Every venture for more wood from the pile just outside the door was a brutal, punishing ordeal that left him gasping, his face raw and his beard caked in ice. The sound was a constant, deafening roar, a physical pressure on the ears that frayed the nerves. Sleep was impossible. It was the same story at the Croft homestead. Their youngest child developed a hacking cough. They hung their heaviest blankets over the windows and doors, but the cold crept in, a palpable entity that settled deep in the bones. They lived in a tiny circle of warmth around their fire, a circle that was constantly shrinking. At the McBride homestead, things were different. As the storm descended, Ewan, Aileen, Fiona, and Hamish finished their supper in the main log cabin. The wind rattled the structure, and the familiar drafts began to snake across the floor. But they were not worried. After cleaning up, Ewan lit a single tallow candle. He led his family not to their beds in the cabin's cold loft, but out the back door and to the cliff face. They entered the narrow tunnel one by one, leaving the roaring chaos of the blizzard behind them. The moment they made the 90-degree turn, the sound of the wind vanished. It was not muffled. It was gone. The air inside the sandstone chamber was profoundly, shockingly still. It was cool, but not the biting, damp cold of the cabin. It was the neutral, steady coolness of a cellar. The air smelled of dry stone, wool, and the faint, clean scent of pine from the boughs on their sleeping platforms. Aileen tucked the children under the heavy buffalo robes. Within minutes, the ambient temperature, which hovered at a steady 52 degrees, felt comfortable. There were no drafts. There was no sound but their own soft breathing. Ewan placed the candle in its niche, where it cast a calm, gentle glow. Its flame stood perfectly straight, a tiny, unwavering spear of light in the immense silence of the rock. They slept. On the second day of the blizzard, the storm reached its peak. The world was a whiteout, visibility reduced to less than 10 feet. The wind drove the snow with such force that it felt like being scoured by sand. It was in these conditions that Hal Mercer realized one of his 2 mules, essential for hauling timber, had broken through its lean-to and vanished into the storm. Losing the animal would be a catastrophic blow, Bundled in every layer he owned, a rope tied from his waist to his cabin door so he wouldn't get lost, Mercer plunged into the blinding fury of the storm. He could barely see his own feet. The wind tore the breath from his lungs and froze the moisture in his eyes. He shouted the mule's name, but his voice was instantly ripped away and swallowed by the roar. He searched in a widening circle, a desperate, freezing ordeal. He knew the mule would likely head for the shelter of the creek bed, trying to get out of the wind. Stumbling through waist-deep drifts, he found himself near McBride's folly. A part of him felt a grim certainty. The foolish Scotsman and his family were likely frozen solid in their damp burrow, a tragic testament to stubborn pride. He should check. If they were in trouble, he had to help. If they were dead, he had to know. He fought his way to the cliff face, the rock providing a slight reprieve from the wind's full force. He found the entrance to the tunnel, a dark slash against the driven snow. He expected it to be drifted over, but the angle of the cliff had kept it mostly clear. He squeezed his shoulders through the opening, bracing himself for a wave of frigid, dead air. The first 8 feet of the tunnel were cold, and the wind's roar was still a deafening presence behind him. Then he made the 90-degree turn, and the world stopped. The sound vanished. One step, and the hurricane was gone. The silence was so absolute, so profound, it was disorienting. He took another step and another. He could feel the air change. The biting cold on his exposed cheeks softened. The air was still, and it carried a hint of warmth. He saw a faint flickering light from around the bend. He crept forward, his heart pounding. He peered into the chamber. What he saw broke his reality. There was no fire. There was no stove. There was only a single candle sitting in a niche on the far wall. Its flame was a perfect, unwavering teardrop of light, so still it looked like a painting. In its gentle glow, he saw the McBride family. They were all asleep on the stone platforms under thick robes. Ewan lay on his back, his chest rising and falling in the slow, deep rhythm of profound rest. Little Hamish had an arm thrown over his mother's shoulder. Fiona was curled into a peaceful ball. No one was shivering. No one was huddled. They were simply sleeping, oblivious to the white apocalypse raging just a few dozen feet away. Mercer stood there for a full minute, utterly dumbfounded. The vindication wasn't an argument, it was a physical sensation. He had just come from a world of screaming wind and brutal, invasive cold. He expected to feel that same cold, perhaps even worse, concentrated in this stone hole. He expected the damp chill of a cave. Instead, the air that touched his face was dry and calm. He reached out a bare hand, his fingers stiff and numb, and placed his palm flat against the sandstone wall. He expected it to be ice cold, to suck the last of the warmth from his skin. It was not. The stone was cool, but it was a living cool. It felt solid, steady, and beneath the surface coolness, there was a deep, resonant neutrality that was closer to warmth than to cold. In that moment, touching the stone, seeing the unmoving flame, and hearing the sound of a sleeping family, Hal Mercer understood. His entire conception of shelter, of warmth and cold, was rewritten. He backed away quietly, his mind reeling. He turned the corner and was instantly assaulted by the sound and fury of the storm. The contrast was so violent, it was like stepping between two different worlds. He stumbled back to his own cabin. The image of the steady candle flame burned into his mind. "You didn't build a room," he thought, his mind struggling to find the words. "You carved a piece of silence from the storm." Silence. When the blizzard finally broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a world of sculpted drifts under a painfully bright sun, Hal Mercer was the first visitor to the McBride cabin. He didn't come with mockery or pity, but with a quiet, deep-seated awe. Ewan was outside, shoveling a path, Mercer walked up to him, his face serious. "Ewan," he said, his voice raspy, "I need you to show me. I need to understand what you've done." Ewan McBride didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply nodded, picked up a shovel, and handed it to Mercer. "First, we dig out your mule shed," he said. "Then, I will show you." The story of how the McBride family slept peacefully through the great blizzard of '76 spread through the Black Hills like a winter thaw. It wasn't the story of a madman's folly, but of a quiet genius's wisdom. Hal Mercer, once the loudest critic, became the most fervent advocate. He described the absolute stillness, the steady candle flame, and the warmth he felt from the stone. He didn't just tell people. He took them to the cliff and had them step inside the tunnel to feel the silence for themselves. The idea was too practical, too effective to ignore. The first to adopt it were not homesteaders, but the freighters and teamsters who drove the long, dangerous routes between the gold camps and the prairie depots. They spent weeks on the trail, vulnerable to sudden, violent storms. A man caught out in a plains blizzard with a wagon load of goods had two choices: outrun it or die. Ewan's technique offered a third. Freighters began scouting their routes for suitable sandstone or even hard-packed earth bluffs. During lulls in their journeys, they would spend a day or two carving out small, single-man emergency shelters, just big enough to crawl into and wait out a storm. They called them McBride Rests or Scotchman's Holes. They were crude compared to Ewan's carefully constructed chamber, but they operated on the same principle of thermal mass and wind-breaking design. By the spring of 1880, more than a dozen of these life-saving shelters dotted the freighting trail between Deadwood and Cheyenne, and at least 4 documented accounts exist of teamsters who survived otherwise unsurvivable blizzards by taking refuge in them. The idea spread not through blueprints or books, but through practical demonstration and word of mouth, the most powerful currency of the frontier. Ewan's innovation was, in essence, a rediscovery of an ancient human technology, earth-sheltered living. What he built in 1876 was a precursor to the modern, energy-efficient designs that architects and engineers champion today. His sandstone chamber was a perfect example of a passive survival shelter. It required no moving parts, no fuel, and no complex technology. Its genius lay in its simplicity and its deep understanding of the local environment. Modern building science has given us sophisticated terms for what Ewan knew in his bones. We talk about the thermal flywheel effect, where a building's mass moderates indoor temperature swings. We use computer models to calculate heat loss and solar gain. We have advanced insulation materials with incredible R values. Yet all of these modern concepts point back to the same fundamental truth that Ewan McBride demonstrated with a hammer and a star drill. The most effective way to manage a harsh external environment is to use the immense, stable thermal mass of the Earth itself. His design anticipated the principles of passive house construction by over a century, proving that true innovation often means looking down at the ground beneath our feet, not up at some new, complicated invention. There is a lesson in the quiet stone of Ewan McBride's winter bedroom. The frontier myth is often one of aggressive conquest, of taming the land, breaking the prairie, and fighting nature into submission. The settlers' log cabins were a reflection of this mindset, a fragile fortress built to fight a constant war against the cold. They stood apart from the environment, always on the defensive. Ewan McBride did not fight the winter. He sidestepped it. He didn't build a fortress against the wind. He found a place where the wind simply ceased to be. His solution was one of accommodation, not confrontation. He understood that the earth holds a deep, patient warmth that the chaotic, violent winds of the sky can never touch. While his neighbors exhausted themselves in a frantic battle on the surface, he found peace by making a strategic retreat into the substance of the world itself. The earth keeps what the wind cannot steal. It was true of the heat stored in the ancient sandstone, and it was true of the quiet wisdom that one man carried with him from an old world to a new one. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of thermal mass and survival fascinating, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of forgotten wisdom. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other ancient or low-tech solutions do you think have been overlooked in our modern world? Disclaimer: this video presents a fictionalized historical narrative for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative reconstruction, while the technical principles of thermal mass and earth-sheltered construction are based on real historical practices and scientific concepts. The application of any building techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety standards, and engineering regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.